So I'd just like to apologize I ran off. I was so enraptured by the talk that I realized, oh God, I'm next and I really have to pee. So I'm so sorry about that. It's really a great honor to have been invited today and to be on this panel, and that was such an amazing talk, Steve. I was in Steve's transport and land use class in my PhD, so it really means quite a bit to me to be sharing the podium with him today. I really enjoyed this highlighting of the importance of centering people in the experience of transportation planning, and I'm just so impressed by the work being done by Mobilizing Justice. I get your concerns, but this idea of making research implementation focused and working with communities and with people working on the ground is just so important, and it's so nice to see that work being done. I didn't really know what to do today, but I thought I would just mention 3 things that I've been thinking about in response to what Steve was presenting. And the first, just building on all of the wonderful things that Steve talked about, I want to just talk quickly about the importance of thinking about lived experience and difference when it comes to questions of equity and accessibility in transport planning. I then want to just quickly talk about the importance of context, and I'm thinking here about economic, historical, and social context. And finally, for anyone who knows me, knows this is kind of my thing, but I do think we need to make power explicit in all questions of transportation justice. And so I'm going to comment quickly on that in 10 minutes. So I really love that we started with Steve's talk on how we need to center people in transportation planning. And I think a lot of this wonderful Mobilizing Justice work does that. But as a qualitative researcher, we take it I try to take it one step further and actually interact with the people on the ground who are experiencing accessibility or experiencing transportation inequities or poverties. And I think those experiences are important and informative in creating a just transportation system. We need to keep in mind that when we're doing these wonderful accessibility metrics, that even people within areas of high or low accessibility might be experiencing that accessibility very differently. These are different people with different needs within these systems. And it's hard to argue as a junior scholar like I am that a lot of accessibility research focuses on these objective causes or outcomes of inaccessibility, but I'm not the only one that does, so I put a little citation there. And that there's less work looking on what it's actually like to do accessibility. So I thought I'd take today to just kind of tell a story of what it can look like to be a researcher looking at what is the experience of doing accessibility, of gaining access. And this is from the work that I've done in Hamilton looking at older adults' public transport accessibility experiences. And as a qualitative researcher, I'm going to do this by telling you a story, because I think stories are powerful. This is a story of one of my research participants who I'm going to call Bob. And this is just one person's experience, but I think his experience was really shared by a lot of the other people that I spoke to. To give you some context, but keep Bob anonymous, Bob was 79, uses a walker as a mobility aid, and gave up his driving license in 2016. Bob lives in downtown Hamilton in an area of really high public transit accessibility. But Bob still puts a lot of thought and a lot of work into accessing the destinations that he needs to get to meet his daily travel needs. For one, getting to the bus stop can be quite difficult because he's not super mobile, especially in the winter, because of poor clearance of snow conditions. So he told me the sidewalks that are not shoveled are a real problem with the walker. In fact, many of the research participants that I spoke to simply didn't leave the house on snowy days. And it wasn't an issue of the snow, it was an issue of poor clearance on sidewalks. Bob actually has a bus stop very close to his house, but he does not use it, even though it is right by his house. He can't walk far, but he still doesn't use it because it's too busy at that bus stop, so he doesn't have room to make sure he has somewhere to sit. And sitting on the bus is absolutely necessary. So he tells me, I used to get the bus at this intersection by my home, but by that time there's so many passengers already aboard, I go to a different one farther away so I can have some space to get organized. So this assumption that people are going to the closest stop, even if they have limited mobility, doesn't always happen either. Getting on and off the bus can also be a challenge for Bob with his walker. He can get on at the front door, which lowers, but if he has to get off at the back door, he's got that step to go down, and that can be quite challenging. He told me, it's only a couple of inches I have to lift up the walker. It's really not that bad. It's just if I'm not feeling well, it feels like 5 feet. Finally, I have 2 more. The back of the bus is also completely inaccessible to Bob because there are steps to get up there. And that's often the part of the bus that has free seats. So he always has this contention of, okay, do I, ask someone for a seat, even though I know there's some that are free in the back, and he feels bad about it, and that's why he walks farther, even though it's hard for him to walk, so that he can get onto the empty bus. And the final thing I'll say is that there's a lot of places Bob wants to go, but he can't, because the walk from those final bus stops to his destinations is just too far for him. So there's these unmet needs that Bob has because the transport system isn't necessarily built for him. So I tell you Bob's story because I think it's a nice compliment, and it shows the ways in which lived experiences are important and insightful when it comes to transport planning. We also seem to have this discussion throughout NECTAR about these two different types of accessibility and how frustrating it can be for people doing accessibility research, that when you talk about it with the lay public, everyone assumes you mean accessibility for people with disabilities. And both are important, but I would also argue that for a lot of people they're completely related. In order to access destinations, you also need access for different mobility needs. And I think this work can also show policy implications for both access to opportunities. There's some of these places that Bob wants to go. A common one, not just for Bob, but for a lot of people, was getting to the waterfront in Hamilton, getting to leisure activities. The transport system doesn't necessarily get him to those destinations that are more important for him. In terms of accessibility metrics, I think it also says a bit about, okay, what are our metrics on what appropriate walking distance are, what kind of impedances are we taking into account, snow being a major one, or snow clearance in particular. But then also policy implications in terms of accessibility for people with limited mobility capacity. So that's my first point. And don't worry, I'm going to be a lot faster on the next two. I won't go over time. But I think what can complement a lot of the wonderful work done on equity and mobility justice is this focus on lived experience and this focus on different, and that these are powerful research tools doing this work as well. My biased opinion, at least. The second thought I had while looking through and listening today to Steve's talk was the importance of context. I think the current literature is really excellent at identifying these patterns of inequality, and in a way that I'm often not, working towards solutions, like actually working with people, making the world more equitable, and that's so wonderful. But what can sometimes be missing is looking big picture at the causes of these inequalities. These are all produced, these are all decisions, policy decisions that are made to create these inequalities. And sometimes we need to go downstream to actually stop inequalities from appearing in the first place. And I do think a lot of these causes are in Karen's wonderful, but yes, a little overwhelming when you look at it at first, framework. And so these economic and political structures, I think, are really important to consider as well. And we can sometimes get so focused in on what's happening in a specific city, and we kind of forget the big picture. Some of the things I think about that keep me up at night are questions of automobility and our increased dependence on the automobile, neoliberal policies, gentrification in the region. And Steve asked us, we don't have the political economy solution to stop a premier from funding something that makes no sense from an equity risk. Ooh.
Mic drop.
Mic drop, yeah. I'm gonna try again, but if it falls, I'm really sorry. I move my hands a lot when I talk, so I need them. Okay, yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen again. And this keeps me up at night as well. And as I was coming here, I live in this dense, walkable neighborhood in Hamilton, and I'm coming to this great, transit-oriented session with all these wonderful people that agree with me. But on my bus ride to Toronto, I passed all of the Ford manufacturing plants on the way in, and we forget that this region is actually deeply steeped in systems of economic automobility. In 2015, and I don't know if it's changed, late last night I tried to find the stat, there's 15 automobile plants in the region, the Toronto region. This is car dependency is really deeply ingrained in the city, even if we can forget sometimes being in this neighborhood or my great neighborhood in Hamilton. And finally, just a quick note on power, and I think the importance of making power relations explicit. I think we can be scared of talking about power, but we shouldn't be. And power is in a lot of the theorizations of mobility justice. This one here is the Mimi Scheller's definition that gets used a lot. She talks about mobility justice in this really great broad sense. I love broad definitions. As this overarching concept for thinking about how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement. We have a lot of focus on inequality, and that's wonderful, but we also need to consider the power. Power in terms of what is prioritized in the planning of our cities, and in terms of intersectional power relationships, such as patriarchy, ageism, classism, racism, influencing daily aspects of mobility. So here's some power structures I'd like to hear more about. And this could be just the acknowledgement in our work of saying things like, it's not just that displacement is occurring, but displacement is the outcome of policy decisions that are made, and there's power in those decisions. Or if we think of Bob's story, it's not just a question that Bob is facing these challenges and having a hard time. These challenges of Bob trying to gain access to locations that are important to him are imposed on him by policies that are ageist or ableist at the level of the city. And saying that can be important, even if we're unaccustomed to, and it can feel kind of scary. So with that, I hope I didn't go over time. I lost track of my timer when my mic dropped. But thank you again for having me as a keynote discussion. It really is a great honor, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Okay, next we have Rafael, Rafael, right? No, Floridea, I apologize.
That's great.
It's fine.
I think they were concerned that we were missing, and then they didn't do the question.
Okay. Sorry. I can blame you.
That's fine. You need to switch over here. Right here? Yeah. Swap.
Okay. First of all, thanks for inviting me to this panel, and this is like a very nice conference and a very nice events with the summer school, with seeing all people interested in justice, in equity, and accessibility. And when I received the first version of the talk of Steve, and thinking about how to react to that, I was thinking that, okay, we already have a quite clear idea about equity, about justice. What next? And I think that is something that is missing in our field, like transport, we need to deal with, and this is really related what Lea was talking about, the power, and what is the power is the human rights and loss and damage. So this is, from my perspective, are the new frontiers that we need to deal in transportation, and we need to as well be humble and to involve in our field, not just the technical aspect, but as well the legal aspects, because when we try to work in the justice perspective, in a human rights perspective, we need to have more tools and related with the human rights and loss and damage language. So just with that, where I'm coming from, because I'm not anymore in the academia, I'm not in the industry, I'm not in the transport operators. We are in this cooperative space that is an organization based in Madrid, developing research action on inclusive mobility, climate change, and gender equality. And then since 2020, we are as well a United Nations observer for the Conference on Climate Change. So this means that we are invited to observe the negotiation on climate change, and just to do our speech and to hope that we will be listening about that. This is matters for us because we cannot be, for example, funded by investor, because the United Nations is looking for our account, and we can just be funded by public money. So this is something that is very important for us to say. And like Steve said, it's of course what I will talk to you about, and the reaction to the Steve speech is not only from my side, but it's the collaborative work that we are doing with my colleagues that are Gianni Rondinella and Marcelo Idet, that who are both cooperativists of this cooperative, and as well other collaborators like Marta, Rosa, Esther, and Isis. So this is where we are, and this is very different, not only with an academic perspective, but as well with a more on the ground aspects. mobility for whom? So this is what was the last part of the question of Steve, and as well what Lea was talking about. We need to think about this kind of people. I liked very much yesterday the way how Angela said the key groups, not just the target groups, not vulnerable groups, key groups. That's all. And this I think that makes sense, and I invited all researchers to use this language in their papers, because it's in our papers as well, because this is a clear way where we are, and the fact that they are not vulnerable per se, they are vulnerable because the societies make them feel vulnerable. And this is something that is very clear when we talk and we work with people with disabilities, or people with low income, or raised people. And that's why I liked the way how Steve talked about not ethnicity minorities, but raised people, indigenous people, and so on. This is the terminology that we need to start to use as well in a technical field where we are, that is the transportation. And transport poverty is a key question. So of course, very appreciate, very grateful to Karen to talking and defining transport poverty in a very very complex way. And this is the key question for assessing transport impacts in terms of inclusiveness, accessibility, equality, and climate change. But as well, we need to think about people, and we all in the first, on the second slide of Steve, we have seen the main domains where we concentrate our job, our research. There are more on the smart cities, more on the productive mobility, that is commuting, and so on. And there is some greatest groups that are just left out, that are these people who are in some way sustaining our lives, that are the caregivers. And I liked it very much, once again, yesterday a talk from Angela talking about this mobility that was that normally it's 40% of the story of travel mobility, but in the case of during the COVID was around 70% of the mobility. And this is something that we need to take into account when we think about equity and justice. And then there is another concept that we started to work on some time ago, that is the needs of people that mobility is covering. And of course, there is relevant studies working on that, and they show that the transport system is perceived as an essential for key human needs in terms of safety, security, in health, employment, and social stability. And I think that this is a very important aspect that we need to consider when to be aware that equity is not a choice. Equity is a necessity. I mean, it's the events that we assist in how the transport is essential for the life of people can force people to protest as well, or to completely be outside of the society. Failing to meet these needs may result in physical, social, geographical, and economic social exclusion, and the great example of Bob just showed that. And observing the real needs of people is very challenging, because even the tools that we use in our research are not always adequate. And we still use for convincing for some project the policymakers the cost-benefit analysis, and this is what most cover the needs of key groups of people. So making unmet needs visible, this is our one of key purposes for us. The notion of needs related to the notion is related to the notion of benefit. So we need to estimate the benefit of these key groups, and this is a way to measuring the needs. Making needs visible is like a challenge, but we need to go for that. And then we go to the mirror notion of needs that are the rights. COVID-19 caregiving crisis show how that the needs of the most at-risk population groups were unmet in some way. So we assist in some cities to a decreasing of offer of public transport because not the people, commuting people in a general way who were using the public transport were using that, and we left out the caregivers people in some place with less accessibility to their key life activities, not only for them but for all the community. So this is important, and for that what was done by other transport operators in some cities related to the to increase the offer of the public services during the COVID is very appreciated. And in a context of inaccessibility and segregation, the forms of claiming the rights to pursue everyday life activities is translated into statements of dissatisfaction. So in the survey, we can see that people are saying, okay, I'm not happy with the system that or services you are providing me, and this is a way, but this could be even go to more virulent street protests. And this is the example that we had in Chile, for example, where the fact of increasing a little bit for some people, but maybe a lot for some others, the price of the ticket make doing protests. So we have not any more excuse for not seeing these needs. And needs are associated with the rights, but once again, in transportation rights, it's a little bit different than the rights that we are talking about for achieving the key life activities. And when we are talking about the rights to mobility, we have in mind these EU passengers' rights, no? When we lose a flight and so on. And this is not exactly the rights that we need to talk about. So it's where is the majority of the rights? I mean, the people who are moving and flying, we are a very smaller community, like people who can do the smart working. We are small community among the board. So let's see once again the key groups. Bringing at the table of transportation the human rights dimensions and languages is a necessity, I think. And I like to launch this idea in this conference because it's always the conference where smaller conference where idea can reach easily people, because maybe people are more involved and are there when we talk about. And recognizing rights to participate, rights to live in good health, right to survive catastrophic events, rights to be protected, all of them are human rights. So this is something that we should take in our mind. The last events as well that we assist with the huge energy crisis show that we cannot dissociate human rights from climate change. And if we cannot dissociate human rights from climate change, we cannot dissociate human rights from transportation, because transportation is contributing 1/3 to the climate change emission and so on. So all that is important for, we need to have these deep inferences in the transportation domain. And we, once again, we have not any more excuse for not seeing unmet needs and rights. Finally, Another concept that we bring from the climate change negotiation, that is the loss and damage. Within the justice framework, our thoughts are going to loss and damage. Never it is too late, like we said in Italian language. I mean, we have time for repairing. If we forget about the key groups long times, maybe now it's the moment to think about them, and we can repair. We need to give them money, give them the resource to bring to come in, to have them with us. So completely agree with Mom thoughts and a question to Steve about why we are in a worse situation than before. And if we have been unable to fairly distribute goods and beds, we need to repair loss and damage of people, including key groups people, women, indigenous people, youth, low income, frontline workers, people with disability, low-skilled people, countries as well. We are not in the same position when we are living in different countries, and we know quite well this aspect, and continents. So it's not the same to be in North America or in South America or in Europe or in Africa. And we have not any more excuse for not repairing. So that's all. And this is a nice picture of an action for advocating for loss and damage during the conference of climate change.
We have one final panelist, but I realize we're going a little bit over on time, which I don't think it's ever happened at an academic conference before. But what is actually happening at 11 is there'll be coffee in the lobby. And so there's a lot for us to discuss, and I'm sure many of you have questions. So what I'm going to suggest is after Rafael is finished with his comments, that feel free to go grab some coffee and come back into the room, and we'll have the panelists here, and we'll have a mic that can be passed around for questions. So once Rafael is done, go get some coffee and come back. The discussion will continue. And then at 11:30, we have our cluster meetings. So we have quite a bit of time, but just letting you know the change in agenda here.
Technical help.
So this is a computer.
It's good. I'll see you.
Yeah, that's fine. So thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation. Actually, I'm actually covering for Eda. It's very unfortunate that Eda couldn't come because of these issues, but I was very flattered, doubly flattered for the invitation to cover that. Believe that I could fill in her shoes and also to be commenting on such an amazing project. Because of the sake of time, I will try to keep all the praise and compliments to Steve and the colleagues of the project for the comment session. And I'll try to make most of my time in emphasizing three key points that I want to make about Steve's presentation. So the first one needs kind of a context, in the sense that I'm very, very happy to see how the Mobilizing Justice project actually takes this step back and looks at justice as this overarching and very complex theories of justice that encompasses so many different aspects and that covers so many different theories and authors that have been working on just cities and urban planning for a long time. And a common thread that you see across multiple books, papers, and theories of justice applied to urban planning and transportation planning really boils down to a tripod or a three-legged stool. Looks like a stool, right? So you cannot really think about justice comprehensively without addressing these three key issues. And I think the Mobilizing Justice, at least thus far, has been showing very promising that it recognizes and it really grasps very well with all of these three types of questions and concerns. So I'll try to make just a couple comments on each of those dimensions. But it's very important to see how Steve in his presentation is emphasizing a lot of the work that the Mobilizing Justice team is putting in trying to understanding procedural justice and trying to understand how the timing of the political planning processes can conflict or not with the participation, like the genuine participation of communities and engaging in the decision-making process. And it's also very nice to see comments like Lea and so many others about the issues of diversity, and that you need to recognize groups' identities, power imbalances, and how these power imbalances and the procedural justice issues, they actually affect inequality and the political outcomes of your decision-making process. But just staying with these two first key points, I like to see one thing. So I'm kind of coming here with a shopping list, what I would like to see, because we have already seen what Steve is promising us. And also I want to say what I would like to see. And one of the things that I really would like to see is I've seen that the Mobilizing Justice has a very strong component on community planning and engagement. And I think, in my humble opinion, one of the very nice innovations that we have seen in the field of accessibility and community engagement planning over the last few years has been the PhD thesis of Anson Stewart at MIT a few years ago, when they developed these really nice interactive tools, these large like tablets that you can use to have community engagements. And it's a very powerful tool to have policy planning scenarios and to get people and communities engaged in showing whether you change a bus stop or a bus route, how it will impact your own community. And because the concepts of accessibility are quite interesting and easy for people to grasp, I think this is a really powerful tool to get out there in the communities and getting them around the table and adding inputs to the scenarios and so they could see what would happen. This is not super bullet, but I think this is a kind of technology that has been enabled by really fast routing engines and accessibility computing models that could be very promising for community engagement when we think about accessibility and equity and participation. But then we go to the third aspect of transportation justice, which is really about equity. And equity is not so much about the inequalities per se, but it's about how institutions, policies, historical processes shape those inequalities. It's about how those inequalities come to be. And it's not, again, about the inequalities per se, but it's about how the inequalities affect people's lives in meaningful ways. And it's about the distribution of the most important benefits and burdens of society, which are accessibility, but also health and environmental externalities related to crash fatalities, health safety, and air pollution and global change. And when it comes to distributive justice, and this is my second point, then we do have two very important and complementary perspectives about thinking about distributive justice, which is thinking about issues from a sufficientarian perspective. Do people have enough? Are people exposed to acceptable levels of pollution? Do people have adequate or sufficient access to healthcare services? Or egalitarian concerns, which is why do some people are the winners of certain transport investments and why some people are the losers of transport investments? Why do some people have so much better accessibility than others? So this is really talking about accessibility poverty and accessibility inequalities. I mean, we could think about exposure to pollution or healthcare risks related, using both sufficientarian and egalitarian perspectives as well, but I'll just focus on accessibility. And I do have to recognize that many of us are not thinking seriously enough about sufficiency. I think this is one of the greatest contributions from Karl Martens. It has really bringing us our attention to reflect more carefully, like we need to think about transport poverty and accessibility poverty. Historically, most of the studies only look at inequalities, and we do need to do a lot of work in that, and I'm grateful to see Steve's pushing this agenda as well. But I just wanted to make my second point that although transport poverty is extremely important, insufficiency is not enough, or sufficiency is not enough. And I just want to have like a very quick mental exercise with you. Imagine a perfect Canadian society or a perfect Toronto city where everybody has you have a certain accessibility poverty line, and everybody is above the poverty line. But now imagine that even though everybody is above the accessibility poverty line, there are black neighborhoods that have relatively lower accessibility because of historical discrimination and inequalities. They are above the sufficiency line. Is that fair? I doubt it, most of us would agree that this is fair. And now in the second scenario, everybody's above the line, the poverty line, but then you have this massive new subway extension or tram investment. And this tram investment or subway expansion increases accessibility much more for high-income communities. I mean, the poor people are above the accessibility poverty line. Would that be fair? And I doubt anyone would here would raise their hand and say, yeah, it's super fair. It's not fair, come on. So I just want to say, like, accessibility poverty is extremely important, and we should be thinking more about this more than ever. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that thinking about inequalities is fundamental as well. Thinking about inequalities is fundamental for several reasons. For at least two of them, thinking about inequality of opportunities is a fundamental concern for moral political philosophy, whatever theory of justice you're coming from. Also, it's really important to think about inequalities if we want to say who are the winners and losers of transportation policy. But as Lea said before me, it is very important that we should have been having more critical discussions and reflections about what are the historical processes and what are the policies that are shaping those inequalities, how those inequalities come to be. It's not just looking at the state of affairs and say, yeah, some people have more and some people have less. It's about thinking critically about how those inequalities came about and how the policies that we enact today are shaping the directions in which those inequalities are going from here. It's also very hard to discuss like how much inequality is tolerable. Is inequality always a bad thing, and to what extent? And finally, my final point. In the NJ, in the Michael Jordan project, there is the second objective, which I personally am much more excited about this objective, which is trying to figure out what are the social, economic, and health, so what is the impact of accessibility on social, economic, and health outcomes? How individuals and communities are actually, how their life chances are changed because of the level of access they have to opportunities. This, I think, if I had to choose one PhD topic for myself, if I were to do a second PhD, that would be one. That's why I'm very excited by the work that some of us here in this room are doing, because I think this is definitely what is lacking from our work. We have lots of amazing research doing all this sophisticated transport accessibility analysis and modeling, and when you talk to economists, they are still using Euclidean distances. So we are doing like we are in the front of the discussion about accessibility modeling analysis, but we do very poor work in looking at the accessibility impacts and outcomes. We do a very good descriptive analysis and some simple statistical models, but we need to think about causal identification challenges. And so I would really like to see in my shopping list that the Mobilizing Justice help us move the needle a bit in this direction with more sophisticated econometric and quasi-experimental design research problems that help us actually think about what are the causal impacts of accessibility on all of those problems. And I think if we want to establish what are the minimum standards for accessibility or to inform policymakers to make those decisions, this is definitely the best way to go forward, and I'm very, very happy to see that Steve and the team is pushing this direction. So thank you very much for your time, and that's only what I have to say.
Thank you. All right, so like I said, we'll go to about 11:20 on discussion, but the coffee should be out there, so feel free to quietly go get some coffee and come back. But I'll invite the panelists and Steve up to the front of the room, and we have about 25 minutes for questions and further discussion. So if I could ask the panelists to come up front, and Pat, if Pat is still around, we'll have a microphone and we'll hand you the microphone if you have questions. So, questions? Or did they solve it? Oh no, I see one here. Kate.
Yeah, Steve, very.
Oh, sorry. Behind you. Yeah. You'll go.
Okay, thanks for your talks. They're all really great. I'm just thinking about, in order to achieve transportation equity, we think that in addition to increasing access to opportunities for those in transport poverty, we also need to be thinking about curbing access to opportunities for those who are hypermobile, maybe particularly traveling by like car or plane for leisure travel. And like, would you also see something like setting maximum, I don't know, standards for travel, like the opposite end of the sufficient-tarian model?
Can I go first? I have a quick answer. So, I mean, there's obviously, climate imperatives for curbing excess travel and whole sorts and other imperatives. Right now, I guess we haven't really approached that side. It's a really interesting question for urban transportation. And we certainly, I don't know that we're I don't know that we're curbing mobility and accessibility, say, for car travel in the name of equity per se, but we're certainly doing that all the time when we try to, say, allocate road space in a more equitable way. When we remove parking spots for bike lanes or remove car lanes for bus priority lanes, we are marginally reducing the mobility of car drivers, for example. And I don't know that we're doing the reduction in the name of bringing their mobility levels down in order to achieve equity. I think we're doing it because in so doing we're bringing up the access levels of other road users, and I think that's still where the focus should be on. But yes, there are often, in order to do that, we often need to reduce the levels of access for some. And I don't want to answer every question first. That's all.
We don't all have to answer all of them.
No.
I think most of the people in the room probably know firsthand what can happen when you try to limit car mobility. I'm thinking of low traffic neighborhoods in the UK, and the people that fight that, or when the bike lanes came in on Bloor and the people that want to fight that. And I think that's also tied into, and I know I'm going to keep going on about this, but the system thought of mobility. We don't think of it as a path-dependent system. We think of it, the general population, as just people made individual choices, and therefore we have the choice and it's easy to drive. But so any removing of that choice feels like an infringement on freedom, but without looking at it structurally, you don't realize that no, structurally we've made it too easy to drive, and that if we made it as easy to use other modes, that would just be a structural shift. So that's my big answer to that one.
Yeah, if I can add very quickly, I think that equity very well implemented in transportation could be the solution for that. I mean, if you decide, for example, to make free or very low cost access to public transport, and maybe even people who are driving now will get out the cars, and then you can as well say, okay, I ask you to leave your car, but I give you more advantages. And we don't care about if they are rich or poor or whatever. What we care about is that use public transport, and in this way, the accessibility will be better for all. So I think that really the key question is use in an instrumental way equity.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that when cities like London or Stockholm implement congestion charging schemes, and they charge people to drive their cars into the city center, they are also reducing their accessibility. If we think about accessibility from a more comprehensive perspective, not only travel time, but also travel costs. But I fully agree with Steve and the others that these policies are being enacted and implemented, like charging for parking space, not because of equity and accessibility, but at least not so much about accessibility and equity, but mostly for environmental concerns or economic concerns and efficiency and pollution. So.
Thank you. We had a question up front that was at the same time, then we'll go back to the rear. Oh, up here.
Hi. Yeah, very nice and very promising, interesting projects. Huge. Steve, you talked about business case, and I was involved a couple of years ago in a business case project, and sometimes I felt like it was very difficult, even impossible to translate into numbers the benefit of something, and it's quite risky to try to, and it's not even quite risky, it's that we are not getting to the point to telling the authorities, it's not always about the money, it's that you are defending the society, or you are giving the society a plus, which is not always related to money. What do you have to say about that? Oh, you.
Just, I mean, yeah, no, of course. And, you know, I advocate for kind of multi-criteria business case analyses, not just cost benefits analyses, or not just having the ratio. And I, you know, I think all of the above is necessary. I actually think that to the extent that we can have business case analyses that more appropriately measure the real benefits of transportation projects rather than, you know, travel time savings, but that will be better. We'll be better off by doing that. But also having a slew of, you know, a wide types of different kinds of evidence. I don't necessarily think it has to be monetary in nature, but I do think that it is likely to be more impactful if it is somewhat quantitative in nature. So having like numbers of health appointments, you know, missed, or number of job seekers, or the length of time it takes job seekers to find a job, or, you know, having some statistics associated with transportation investments that aren't necessarily monetized, but at least kind of quantified, will be very, very useful and instrumental in allowing decision makers to pick up on those facts and pieces and arguments and use them to support better projects.
Yeah, sometimes when they don't see like this translation into numbers, they think that you're not getting to the point. Okay, they want to see numbers because they're used to numbers, blah 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 blah. But especially related to money. But when you don't get to this monetization, then they think